I'm guessing the house lights are on. Maybe I can start. I'm Jeff Cowan. I'm the president of the Annenberg. Can you all hear me? It's not that big a room. I'm the president of the Annenberg Foundation Trust at Sunnylands, which is the sister organization to the Annenberg Foundation. And I just want to start by thanking the Annenberg Foundation for their tremendous generosity today in letting us use this remarkable facility, the Annenberg Space for Photography. If some of you have not really had a chance to be here before to look at the photography, you really should. It's really quite remarkable. And actually, later, our lunch, I think we'll be using a facility for the first time that they have just created. So it's really very, very special they've done it. And they've done it partly because of their fondness for us as a sister organization, but also for David Dreier, whom I'll have a chance to say a few words about in a moment. Some of us are also going to be at a second event at the same time today, which has to do with a topic of cross-border data flows, a very exciting and interesting issue that the Dreier Commission is also dealing with. I'm going to be slipping out to be at another Annenberg Foundation creative facility, the Annenberg Beach House. So we're very much in the Annenberg's debt today, but we're particularly in the debt of Leonore and Walter Annenberg, who created this remarkable estate in the desert, left it with a wonderful endowment, really for two purposes. Partly to be a spectacular place for people to visit, and if you've not visited there yet, I hope you will. We've so far had over 93,000 visitors since we opened just 15 months ago. And it's become one of the remarkable destinations to visit. For people in Los Angeles, it's a little like the Huntington. It's just a beautiful garden, it's a beautiful, beautiful place to visit with wonderful history, and we will welcome you there. But they also left it to be what they hoped would be a place for high-level important retreats and meetings that might even become the Camp David of the West. As you probably all know, we are about to in fact be the Camp David of the West, because quite remarkably, 2 weeks from now, the presidents of the United States and China will be holding a summit meeting at Sunnylands. And we're all,
it's a week from Friday, Jeff.
It's a week from this Friday. And we're very excited about actually the White House. Thank you, David. In fact, the advance team and the Secret Service arrived this week, and we're already working with them on exactly what's happening on the ground. It's a very exciting moment, and a lot of people have asked me about the history of how it happened, and we actually have an incredible archive of how this came about that we will make public at some point, and you'll see how this amazing thing happened. But of all the things that led to it, it really was the Annenbergs and their vision and their creating this remarkable space. But the Annenbergs hoped, and David will talk about this a little bit more, that the Annenberg retreat at Sunnylands would focus on the Pacific Rim or the Greater Pacific region, and so did our trustees, who adopted as their first area of focus work in this area. And as many of you probably know, the first retreat that we held was on the United States and Mexico. David Ayon, who's here, was a key part of that. It was in partnership with the Woodrow Wilson Center, and it led to some very, very important ideas that we think were part of the dialogue and the outcome of the meeting between the President of the United States and President of Mexico that took place a couple of weeks ago in Mexico City. But also we're going to continue with that. And following up on the ideas of the US-Mexico retreat, which is so perfect for Sunnylands, which has a history itself with Mexico and Mexican art, but also is located in a place where so much of the population is from that region. Our first stop after we did it actually was the House Rules Committee, where David Dreier, then a member of Congress, hosted us to talk about how to get a bipartisan group in Congress behind the ideas. And then we went to both political conventions with the ideas that emerged from this retreat. And again, David Dreier was instrumental in our being not at both conventions yet. He was not yet his bipartisan self, but very instrumental in at the Republican convention. Of the things that we're doing, I think there's none that's more exciting than the initiatives being undertaken by the Annenberg-Dreier Commission, which has really taken a mandate which David Dreier will describe to you in a globally important area. And I think that what they're doing today in this facility, in this Annenberg facility, and what they're doing at the Beach House, really is a tribute both to the Annenberg's vision, but truly to somebody who they loved, almost like a son to them, a man who was a great congressman, and now I'm so proud to say is the chair of the Annenberg-Dreier Commission, doing wonderful things, David Dreier.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and it is a great honor to be able to be here at the Annenberg Space for Photography. And let me at the outset say that it's interesting. We all know that yesterday was Memorial Day, and it's a day for remembering the war dead. And for us to be able to be in this spot with this amazing photo exhibit that underscores in many ways why it is that we do what we do. We, the Annenbergs, we as human beings are doing everything that we possibly can to ensure that what we see on the walls here at the Annenberg Space for Photography never, ever happens again. That's got to be a goal that we have, and so our mission is to improve the human condition. And I will say that I like to describe, and Jeff very generously said that when he heard me share the quote that I used to use in debate often and feel is really the raison d'etre for this commission, it's to improve the human condition by encouraging the free flow of goods, services, capital, information, ideas, and people. And in our case in particular, it's throughout the greater Pacific. And we've been drawn to the Pacific, as Jeff said so well, because of a vision that Walter Annenberg put forward in a discussion that I had with him, actually several discussions that I had with him at Sunnylands going back decades. And I've got to say that we are here today for a particularly important reason, not simply the work of our commission, but we're here because of a partnership that we have established with a very impressive organization. It's called the Council of the Americas. It was established by David Rockefeller, again, many years ago, someone who, like Walter Annenberg, has had the ability to touch the future. I've worked with him on a wide range of areas with the Asia Society, a group that he founded called the Emergency Committee for American Trade. But we are here because this publication has been launched, and we are very fortunate that we're going to have with us a number of the authors of these great articles. And I've got to say that as I've gone through and read this issue of America's Quarterly, I'm really struck with what it was that I encountered 3 decades ago when I had the honor of representing California in the United States Congress and where we are today. And I think back to the early 1980s, going into the decade of the 1980s, and recall very well, I know that no one in this room is old enough to remember the 1980s, but I will tell you that if you go back and look at the fact that we in Central America had a civil war that was taking place in El Salvador, we had an air base and a port that were being built by the Soviet Union in Nicaragua at that point. We had military dictatorships. Granted, we were in the midst of the Cold War dealing with proxy wars, but we had military dictatorships throughout Latin America, and we had economies that were absolutely devastated. And I remember very vividly in the late 1970s, in fact, specifically, it was on the 6th of November of 1979, Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy for President of the United States. And in that announcement, he said something that at the time was seen as absolute heresy. He envisaged this accord, an accord of free trade that would extend throughout this entire hemisphere and then move globally. And so in the 1980s, because I had been sent back there at the same time from President Reagan's home state, I talked about this. And it was little more than a joke at that point. I remember going to my first meeting of the USMexico Interparliamentary Conference in 1981. President Lopez Portillo was there, and I began talking, and Democrats, Republicans from the United States, and virtually unanimity of thought in Mexico was that the idea of breaking down tariff and non-tariff barriers between the United States of America and Mexico was something that not only was not achievable, but would be useless and worthless and just plain wrong. And I look at where we are today compared to what it was that I encountered when I first got there, and that's why this publication with pieces, I don't want to pick out a favorite article, but Andy Baker, who is here, has one that is entitled Gringo Stay Here. And last night, as we were at dinner, I was sitting with Andy, and someone said, gosh, why is it that they all hate us so much in Latin America? Well, guess what? As Andy points out very clearly in his piece in America's Quarterly, they not only don't hate us, but every single country in Latin America has a majority of its populace that respects the United States of America. Now, that's something that most people really have a difficult time comprehending. Now, I recognize that it ranges from just over 50% in Argentina, and Mexico is number 2 as far as a lack of enthusiasm for the United States, and Andy goes into a lot of discussion about that. It has to do primarily with economic ties and some historic factors here. But the support rate for the United States goes as high as 80%. So that's why when I look at the accomplishments that have been made within this hemisphere over the past 3 decades, it is something which we can all celebrate. And that's why I was very enthused when Chris Sabatini joined with the chairman of my policy working group, Bill McElhaney, in coming up with this idea of bringing from New York, the headquarters of the Council of the Americas, here to Southern California to focus on this. Now, our commission is designed to do something that has really not been done as effectively as it could be. In New York and Washington, where I've spent most of my adult life, we have a tendency to be very Eurocentric. The focus is across the Atlantic. And if you think about it, there are a wide range of transatlantic organizations that exist. Our focus, the United States of America's focus, has primarily been on Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And people often forget that we are on the verge of seeing nearly 2/3 of the global gross domestic product and nearly two-thirds of the global population around the Pacific. And that's why I've regularly proudly argued that California is the largest, most important state in the Union. But I affectionately, in 1999, when I was delivering a commencement address out at Pepperdine, I coined the term California, Southern California especially, is the Silk Road of the third millennium. When you think back to the route that was traversed by Marco Polo, when you think about what it is that we do here in Southern California, we need to recognize that, and Robin Kramer reminded me of the exact figure just the other day, 40% of everything that is consumed by Americans comes through the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles, and 40% of everything that we as Americans manufacture and export goes to the world through the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles. And so by virtue of that, I like to describe Southern California as the Silk Road of the third millennium. And so what is it that we're doing here? Well, we are in the midst of launching an effort that is focused on bringing together Asia, the Americas, and the rest of the greater Pacific. And I cannot tell you how excited I am about this. It was 98 days ago, so this week will mark 100 days since we, at Sunnylands, with President Cowan, launched our commission. And again, it's a very personal thing for me because I hearken back to the conversations that I had with Ambassador and Mrs. Annenberg at Sunnylands, talking specifically about the role that Sunnylands would play when they passed away and we're not there any longer, their vision for the future of Sunnylands. And I think constantly about how we are, with the work of this commission, doing exactly what it is that they had envisaged. And so I cannot say how much I'm very how proud I am to have all of you here today. We've got an extremely exciting program. Jeff mentioned the fact that we are multitasking because as we are here focusing on unveiling America's Quarterly and talking about the relationship with this hemisphere juxtaposed to Asia in a big way, we are looking at a very specific issue. Now, I described our mission as focusing on the free flow of goods, services, capital, information, ideas, and people throughout the greater Pacific. Well, that flow of information is often being challenged. It's being challenged by governments. It's being challenged by other entities. And so it seems to me that we need to do everything that we can to figure out how we strike the balance, dealing with security, dealing with intellectual property rights, dealing with those issues, and at the same time ensuring the universal right of access to information. And so, beginning in just a few minutes, we're going to have a team of first-rate people from the Brookings Institution and from around the world. And just this week, I'm very pleased to have joined the Brookings Institution, and I'm going to be working with them on a number of issues, but this is one. And so Jeff used this term. He said it was exciting. It's frankly not exciting. When you say cross-border data flows, most people's eyes glaze over. And so I actually say what this really is, it's about the flow of information, and again, that universal right to ensure that every single human being has access to what it is that they want to have access to. Now, what does that mean in a big way? It means that we, by virtue of that, will be able to see the development of political pluralism, the rule of law, democratic institutions, self-determination, those things which we as Americans have a tendency to take for granted. And so the meeting is actually exciting, even though it is about cross-border data flows. And so I've got to say that for us to do these two things together is a thrill. So it's been less than 100 days that since we launched this commission, but I believe that we are doing a lot of great things, and we have many different things in store, and we look forward to input and recommendations that any of you might have as to how we can improve the human condition by encouraging that free flow of goods, services, capital, information, and ideas and people throughout the greater Pacific. Now, one of my great friends, someone whom I met in the late 1998, someone who had just taken on a new responsibility to become Director General of the World Trade Organization. And it was a Herculean task, and it continues to be a huge, huge task. And I've got to say that 1 year after I met him, I had the opportunity to be with him and President Clinton in Seattle, Washington, for the very famous ministerial meeting that took place for the World Trade Organization. And you'll recall, it was the first time in my life, by the way, that I actually inhaled, I haven't inhaled much of anything, but oxygen. I inhaled tear gas. I remember Phil Condit, Mike, the head of Boeing then, said to me, he said, "Don't go outside, David." So, of course, the first thing I did was walk outside, and I inhaled tear gas because of all the protesters and the big battle that was going on in Seattle at that time. But Mike did the job, and it was, again, huge and still very, very challenging today. But that meeting was not the most successful meeting. That's kind of an understatement. But I like to point to the fact that after that meeting, the failure of that meeting in December of 1999, the cover of The Economist magazine had a very interesting photograph. On the front of it, it said, "Who was the big loser in Seattle?" And guess what was there? It was a photograph of a starving baby in Bangladesh. And that's the case that Mike Moore has made more compellingly than anyone in his great tome called Saving Globalization. Because Mike and I would be on opposite sides of the political spectrum. If he were here in the United States, he'd probably be more affiliated with the other Michael Moore we know than well, I said more so. No, he calls himself the other Mike Moore. The other Michael Moore. Let me just put it, this guy is, he's not a hardcore right-wing conservative. Is that face to say? Okay, there we go. Okay, so I've got that. The point I'm making is that in his book, Saving Globalization, he, from the left, makes the most compelling arguments as to how it is that we will be able to work to improve the quality of life and the standard of living for people who are struggling to get onto that first rung of the economic ladder. And he served as Prime Minister of New Zealand, as I said, Director General of the World Trade Organization. He's currently the New Zealand Ambassador to the United States. And again, his position, having been the Director General of the World Trade Organization, is very interesting in that this amazing new trading bloc, which will, when completed, be the largest trading bloc in the history of the world, right now known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's comprised of 11 nations. I hope it gets up to maybe 14 very soon, adding Japan, South Korea, and Colombia. That's aspirational for me. That will make up more than 40% of the global gross domestic product. And New Zealand played a role, along with Singapore, in really launching the effort of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the understanding of what it takes to break down these barriers is very, very, very key. And so I've got to say that we're going to hear from Mike Moore now, then Chris Sabatini, the editor of America's Quarterly, is going to speak. We're going to have a panel. At lunch, we're very pleased. President Toledo had to return to Peru and has just flown in to be back with us. We're going to have Gustavo Arnat, who is the Executive Director of the United States to the Inter-American Development Bank. He's going to be here with us, and so I appreciate the leaders that we have here and are going to be having here, and I'd like to say you're in for a real treat now. His Excellency, the Ambassador from New Zealand to the United States of America, my friend Mike Moore.
Well, thank you again, David. I do remember our first meetings, and I do remember Seattle pretty well. But what was our objectives? We talked them through. 1, getting China into a rules-based system. 2, attacking poverty at its core by launching a development round. We got the first one up. The next one, the wheels are spinning, but we'll talk about that later. Firstly, to acknowledge the Annenbergs and their vision and commitment, and to say how the world is looking forward to the two presidents meeting next week. This is the most important relationship over the next 50 years of how China and the US work themselves together. So we're all looking, we're all watching, and we're all holding our breath. Because this goes wrong, everything goes wrong. I don't believe it will, because I think we've learnt. David, you spoke of the magnificent advances in the Americas, where there's never been so many people free in the marketplace, free in the ballot place, free in the factories, in the history of the Americas. I could explain to folk here who may not know my region as well, the same story could be told of ASEAN. Here we have, in my lifetime, the Southeast Asian nations at each other's throats in big ways. There was, after the Second World War, we didn't call it a war, we called it an emergency. We're Commonwealth, but delicate, you know, with the English language. But our troops were in, dealing with the communists in Malaya. Then we had we didn't call it a war here either. We called it confrontation, where Indonesia objected to the new Malaysia coming out. And our hard men and women from the Commonwealth, Australia and New Zealand were in there dealing to that. And if you think of the history of the region, from the tragedies of Vietnam to the killing fields, there's not a region where the physical boundaries are so under dispute, the sea boundaries are under dispute, but overall ASEAN is moving in a positive direction, in a slow way that Anglo-Saxon and Celtic people sometimes get frustrated with, but moving in a progressive way. And look what's happening in Burma. Sure, there's problems, enormous problems of cultural differences and dialects and tribes, but overall I can report from my region the same sort of sensible, modest progress and a convergence of ideas. To you, David, I want to thank you. You're a true believer. You're a hero of economic and political freedom. And I think when the history of trade is written for the next 10 years, I hope it will say this, that this seminar will go down as a place where the substance, the vision and the drive emerged to widen the trade agenda, to do the serious hard lifting and hard thinking about issues such as data flows. And maybe with your stuff on the Americas, begin to set the stage for a great convergence eventually between what we're doing in the Americas, RCEP, TPP, EU, US, etc. And maybe that's how we're going to get the big bang, but there'll be a series of explosions which will come together later on. You know, the bridge to getting the Uruguay round done was services. And I thought at the time maybe we could do services because there were no ministers of services. There were no infrastructure. There's no one to consult. We're ahead of the play because we now had an idea that was not quite ripe. But because it wasn't ripe, it wasn't rotten either. It wasn't rotten by bureaucrats. It wasn't rotten by self-interest. It wasn't rotten by crony capitalists and phony bureaucrats, right? And so maybe what you're doing here is creating a new bridge between the old and the new issues in the trade agenda. Yesterday was Memorial Day, David. In my country we have an Anzac Day, which we also celebrate what our men and women have done. And maybe it's time to also reflect that the greatest generation who survived the Great Depression, who fought a great war, then fought a Cold War, they were more than just warriors, as opposed to our generation, who were warriors. They were peacemakers, and they made the peace. And men and women of vision and incredible generosity met before the war was over to manage what would be the post-war architecture. Incidentally, there are fewer people at the Mount Washington Hotel in New Hampshire setting up the Bretton Woods institutions. There are fewer people there than we have at TPP meetings. Something to remind ourselves of, Geoff, from time to time. But they were a fantastic generation. We all know the history. The Great Depression was made more lethal, more deadly, more prolonged, more tribal, more vicious because of competitive devaluations, because of protectionism. And this generation met and they thought, what can we do? We will create the United Nations where the League of Nations failed. The greatest generation then turned its mind to creating the IMF and the World Bank and the GATT, which became the WTO. And then, which was perhaps the most magnificent and generous act of a victor in the history of the world, was the Marshall Plan. Whose idea was that? To rebuild and make citizens and producers and customers of your enemies. This was an act of enormous intellectual and financial generosity. It's astounding when you think of it. Maybe this is part of what is special about America. Maybe this goes back to Lincoln's second inaugural, where he argued with malice towards none and charity towards all, that these men and women of this great generation just lifted the whole thing beyond the petty and towards the bold and towards the great. Sometimes, David, I think what would happen now in the Congress if opinion poll was done and the cameras are on Congressman. Here's your choice, Congressman. We do a tax cut or we give money to these people who killed your son and maimed your daughter and have the Marshall Plan. Which way would you vote? By God, if the opinion polls were tough then, it'd be hard to get it through the Congress. But you got it through. So here it is. Are we up to it to do what our parents and grandparents did? Can we recapture that practical idealism and provide for institutions and structures and opportunities that can capture those shining moments, in the words of someone else, the shining city on the hill? I think we are up to it. New Zealanders, we're by nature internationalists and by nature multilateralists. It's a function of distance, it's a function of small country. We instantly think of international and global solutions to problems because we know that no nation, mighty or modest, can hope to have clean water, run an airline, manage a tax system, do anything without the cooperation of others. And that is even truer now than it was. When the greatest generation made their decision, 50% of the world's industrial capacity lay here. My heart is broken that the Doha round has gone on hold, But I'm not one who thinks the Doha round should be announced as a dead beast. It's going to be very hard to get a round up. But I do think, I've always thought, the greatest moral, environmental and development issue we face is how to bring another billion people into the global economy, that our problem is not globalisation but not enough globalisation, and to bring this extra billion producers, citizens and customers into the system, and multilateralism is still our best hope to do it. But in the absence of progress in Geneva, we can't wait. We need to do things. My country had very few trade agreements. We did one with Australia. You know, how hard is that? Now we're quite promiscuous. We'll just about do it with anyone. We're building up a body of thought, a body of standards, a bodies of experience, which we believe can flow on. That is why the TPP and the Pacific Alliance is so important. If we can do some things here, we can put more gas in the tank. We can widen the agenda. We can lift the standards to the highest possible level. This will provide a platform for all sorts of other things to happen. We are true believers in the 21st century issues. IP, the supply chain arguments. I just heard a figure the other day that astounded me from Mexican, that for every dollar Mexico exports anywhere in the world, 40 cents of that is an American input. This whole supply chain thing has changed things so dramatically that our trade figures are redundant. Trade facilitation, coherence between our agencies, data flows, all these things are substantial and important. So I want to congratulate David and the group here, because you'll provide the intellectual input, the forensic work on data flows that we need to put into these 21st century issues to create this new platform, almost ISO 2000 standard setting platforms that others can aspire to and negotiate up to, not negotiate down from. That's the fundamental difference. Most trade negotiators are like old generals, David, as you know. What they're doing is negotiating on old experiences. Just when we get a deal on mustard gas, somebody's invented the machine gun. And so we're always out of date. So what we have to do, I think, in TPP and other arrangements is have an agreement that can grow and be living and without the torture of a relaunch every time. So when we set up the WTO after the Uruguay round, some of us actually believed that there'd be no more trade rounds. This is a permanent negotiating machinery. We could just slice each sector as it came up. That was proven not to be so, because the grubby little secret of the Uruguay round was there a whole lot of old issues that were pushed aside. Textiles, we'll do it over 20 years, but it only works in the last year. Big slices of agriculture not covered. So the developing countries in Seattle, in a way, quite correctly, I understand their position. Said, why on earth should we face new issues when you haven't satisfied my old issues? Well, we make the case the new issues are actually fundamentally important to the developing countries as well. They, more than anyone, need open telecommunications. They, more than anyone, need trade facilitation. They, more than anyone, need what you're doing in data flows to elbow out the bureaucrats, to elbow out the businesses and the privileged and the protected, and those who are just screwing their economies for a few. However, these countries do need some attention on their old issues, and we do too, because the reality is our political economy is based on old issues. That's where the wealth is, that's where the pressure groups are. We have to do both. And while I concede that economic history has sped up, we have to face some of these issues I talked about earlier. To get to these 21st century issues, we have to get over some of the 20th century ones. Take Vietnam. 90 million people, young, hungry, in a rough neighbourhood. It's the only place in the world where people have been disappointed I'm not an American. America's enormously popular there. They have said publicly. And I said to the ambassador, can I quote that? He said, yes, we will accept just about every chapter on TPP. We need this to remodel our economy, to take it into the 21st century. This will provide the disciplines on us, the old story of external force to drive up internal reform. You don't quite have that in America, but we do. We managed to remodel our economy in part based on what we did with opening our economy to Australia. We need it. But I need to take home something on textiles, footwear, and catfish. And I think that's fair enough. So, the greatest generation handled a Cold War and nuclear standoff. The greatest generation handled a collapsed Europe on the brink of anarchy, communism, and return of fascism. Can the grandchildren of the greatest generation handle sugar? Can the grandchildren of the greatest generation handle rice? Can the greatest generation's grandchildren handle issues like dairy? I think we can. But it's going to be hard. But I think it's easier to do these things early than later, and the longer it takes, the harder it'll get. But here we are. I've got a new sign in my office which says, remember, you're only an ambassador. Here's my fears. And Geoff and I have shared this over. I think he might agree with me, just like us coming and arguing and drinking our wine, let us not become a mini APEC, where every year we celebrate a new member. Let's not fall into the trap of always thinking, of course, Brazil should be in. It's unthinkable that China isn't part of this eventually. But I use the word eventually, and perhaps you ought to put the word tranche into it. Get the first tranche over with and then add. TPP has always been an expanding model. It started with just a couple of countries, got bigger and bigger. But maybe it's because I sat at the first APEC meeting in Canberra. Maybe it's because I drank wine, and if it was champagne, I would have drank champagne. When the Bangor goals were announced of free trade with developed countries by 2010, free trade with the developing countries in 2020. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just have this fundamental fear that 500 people in a room becomes 1,000, becomes 1,500. And if we can lock this thing in parallel with others, we can then widen it and build it. And maybe in a few years, the great convergence happens. So long as, it depends how ambitious we are. If we really are ambitious in terms of these new issues, which we are, we understand the complexities, we have major privacy issues, we understand these complexities, boy, we have to go right high. And if we're going to compromise and water it down and have exclusions, and this is all too hard, there's one shoe factory in Maine, there's 17 congressmen in a certain place who have been too close to a couple of their vested interests. If we're going to do that, let's just have APEC meet twice a year. Okay.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. And let me just say that as he was discussing, among other things, the challenge of the post-war world and the establishment of the Marshall Plan, I was thinking about the fact that if you look at the last century, we have had a couple of hinge moments. 1914 really saw the end of a growth period because of the introduction of a flow of protectionism that followed. 1945 was the exact opposite. 1945 was when the post-war leaders came together to establish what Mike was just talking about, that being the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT. And the idea was to break down these barriers. And we today are, I believe, at another hinge moment. We're at a hinge moment because I think that in many ways what Mike was discussing, and it's very, very bold, he's one of the very few people associated with the World Trade Organization who has been willing to step forward. While he won't quite acknowledge what most people do, and that is that the Doha round of the WTO is not have a very bright future. He's not going to declare it dead. Some of us have maybe gone so far as to say that. But Yeah, keep the bread, okay. The thing that I think is important to note is that he is one of the few associated with the World Trade Organization who has been willing to accept the notion of working regionally. Most people associated with the WTO have cast that as out of hand. And I will say that I believed all along that any time we can break down barriers, we are going to enhance the quality of life and the standard of living for people. Again, those who are just struggling to get onto the first rung of the economic ladder. And so I've actually advocated something that I don't believe that a lot in the United States have said. There's this talk of what's called TTIP. It's the US-EU Free Trade Agreement. I said, no, it shouldn't be the US-EU Free Trade Agreement. It should be the NAFTA-EU Free Trade Agreement, because that's a block of nations in Europe, and we also have, obviously, this Northern Hemisphere with a North American Free Trade Agreement. And similarly, as I said, the Trans-Pacific Partnership will be the largest trading bloc in the history of the world, comprising, if we add those countries of Japan, South Korea, and Colombia, I hope gets in too, it'll be more than 40% of the global economy. And so I just want to say that thank you very much for those remarks, Mike. And I was reminded also as I listened to him of something that a guy who used to be the head of Lou Gerstner, of IBM, Lou Gerstner, and I had this conversation one time. And we both came to the same conclusion. And I'm going to say something that I rarely do. People ask the question, if there's one place in the world that you could live other than the United States of America, where would it be? And we both at the same time said New Zealand. For those of you who have not been there, New Zealand is an incredible place. I went bungee jumping on A.J. Hackett's Kurrawa Bridge on the South Island, Mike, and I didn't get my eyes thrown out there doing that. But New Zealand is a spectacular, spectacular country, and they are very fortunate as Kiwis to have had Mike Moore serve in these capacities that he has and to now have them representing their country here in the United States of America. So I have mentioned this publication. The reason that we're here in Los Angeles, as opposed to their headquarters in New York, this is something unusual, is that we have, because of this tremendous transformation that's taken place in the last 3 decades, we have these countries that traditionally were fighting amongst themselves, fighting against us, dealing with tremendous internal struggles, now finally being able to go global. I mean, what can be a better indication of success than the notion of business and government leaders in Peru, in Chile, in Colombia, thinking about expanding their fortunes across the Pacific Ocean. To me, it's a very, very exciting thing, and that's why I'm privileged to be able to introduce Chris Sabatini. Chris Sabatini founded this publication 6 years ago, and it has rapidly become, without a doubt, the most read and respected journal on Latin America that exists. And as I said, I mentioned David Rockefeller earlier, who founded the Council of the Americas, and then these other organizations with which I've been privileged to be associated, the Asia Society and the Emergency Committee for American Trade. But clearly, the work that is being done and has been done by the Council, as well as by Chris specifically with this publication, is sending a very, very strong message. And I've got to say that one of the things that we have with our new commission is this notion of developing and my hope is that we will be able to do everything that we can to see a number of partnerships. I mentioned the partnership that we have that's going on right now with the Brookings Institution. We've already done so with the Woodrow Wilson Center, and today we are broadening this partnership that we have with the Council of the Americas, and there are going to be a number of other organizations with which we plan to work. But again, Chris is not only the editor of America's Quarterly, but from my perspective, his most important role is that he serves as a member of the policy working group of the Annenberg-Dreier Commission. And so it's in that capacity that I'm pleased to introduce my friend Chris Sabatini.
Okay. I like to think that the consolation to the panel and the audience here for not being in Beach House in Santa Monica is we're not going to be talking about data flow. So relax. And what we're going to do, I'm just going to have everyone just come on up. Forgive me, I hope our mics are working now. I was the one who just did that brief Jimi Hendrix impression. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, thanks. Come on up, and I'll start the panel right now. But let me just say briefly about the magazine.
Yeah, I think you read that.
Let me just say briefly about the magazine, because as David, I want to echo two things David said. The first is that this is really a hinge moment for not just the region, but for the world. The region is looking elsewhere now, and it's growing, and it's now become a viable partner for the United States in its own right. That it's not just a sort of region that is to be pitied, or a region that is to be a position for proxy wars, but is now a region that has come into its own and has become a viable partner, an important partner for the United States. The second is, for that reason, it's become a very exciting time to work on Latin America, because I think it's attracting not just attention, but it's attracting people and institutions that are breaking the mold of the past. And that, in part, is one of the reasons why we started America's Quarterly. The New York Times journalist once said, Scotty Reston, once said that Americans will do everything for Latin America except read about it and understand it. And indeed, that's been true for a long time. Despite the fact that we export more than 20%, we being the United States, of our goods to Latin America, that the major flow of immigrants and new labor that comes to our shores comes from Latin America, the fact that increasingly our cultures have become intertwined, where salsa sells more than ketchup, where the bands we listen to, the telenovelas we copy, come from Latin America. We still don't know much about the region that lies just south of our border. What we really wanted to do with America's Quarterly was change that. And change that in two ways. The first was, at the risk of sounding iconoclastic, I wanted to sort of break up the old schemes of the past. To demonstrate, as David said and Mike said, free trade and access to markets is important, not just for development, but because it uplifts, it ennobles. And that to demonstrate that there is in Latin America, despite the old Cold War battles that raged for decades, there's a wide center, a sensible center, or if you want to quote Richard Nixon, the silent majority. People that believe in markets, people that believe in human rights, people that believe in exports, people that believe in democracy, that often gets lost in all the noise in Washington around Cuba or around the civil wars of the past. And we really wanted to become very iconoclastic in the way we talk about Latin America ideologically. That you can be pro-globalization and be pro-LGBT rights. That you can be pro-human rights and still sort of condemn democratic, or pretend democratic demagogues who shut down freedom of expression and crush the checks and balances of power in places like Venezuela. And that you can also sort of demand an accountability of the human rights of the past, of the 80s, and still believe in markets, and still believe in the United States. And that's very much what we've been trying to do. That's what we're going to try to do today. We'll open up the discussion with the three panelists here. Now, you all have their bios. Since this is a magazine launch, I like to assume a certain amount of literacy in the audience. So I won't read them to you. But two of them are authors, and then there's the honor of being on the panel also with David. So without further ado, I'll start the panel. What we'll do is we'll talk for about half an hour, just asking questions, and then I'll invite you to pose questions as well to the panel, and then we'll break briefly and have a second panel that will talk about the implications of what we've talked about here and the change. We've been paying attention. We've seen that President Obama went to Mexico and Costa Rica. Vice President Biden is in Colombia, and Brazil, and Trinidad and Tobago. So clearly, something's happening also that it's seizing the imagination of the U.S. administration. We want to talk about what that means. So let me just make my way over to my director's chair. And I should say also that Jeff and Dan and Jeff came from Shanghai and Dan came from India. They arrived yesterday, so I'll nudge you if you fall asleep. So they're battling jet lag, I'm sure, so they're here. You don't have to have read the magazine before you came here. We'll give a summary of the articles, but I'm going to refer to the articles. Let's start with Jeff. You write about the TPP, and we labeled it as being the next big thing. Explain why it's important for Latin America, for Asia, and primarily just for the whole trend towards free trade in the world?
Well, David, in his introduction, said how big the Trans-Pacific Partnership is, and it will account for about 40% of global output. So it is, in the absence of a big multilateral round, the biggest thing in the world trading system going on right now. But it's the next big thing for Latin America because of the importance of Latin American economic relations with Asia, the fastest growing region in the world, and because a number of Latin American countries have already begun to establish trade agreements across the Pacific. Now, the Pacific Alliance that brings together Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico have agreements with each other, and they are now trying to integrate their own region so that they can become more competitive and ensure their continuing role in global supply chains and indeed increase their exposure in Asia-Pacific trade. Much like what Canada and Mexico are doing with the United States, in joining TPP, they're ensuring that we deepen our integration so that we can better compete across the Pacific and increase our trade and investment. So for the Pacific Alliance, the ability to enter into this big trade initiative would be incredible. Incredible both for the new opportunities it creates for employment and investment in the region, incredible for the model it will set for the rest of Latin America, and I see the possibility of countries that have the vision of turning their economies into a 21st century platform for economic growth, one that can be inspiring for the region and for the benefit of the people in their countries. That's why I said it's the big thing.
Explain a little bit about what the Pacific Alliance is, because clearly Vice President Biden's trip to Colombia, and jump in, any of you, is in part because of that, because it comes on the heels of the Pacific Alliance Summit that took place in Cali, Colombia last week.
Well, yeah, I mean, I said the Pacific Alliance is trying to integrate the economies so that they don't have restrictions among themselves, so that they can better use the resources in their own region. But this is something the United States should be a part of, too. I mean, we should be a part of the Pacific Alliance. We have individual agreements with these countries, but we don't have a joint platform with them all. And indeed, that's what the free trade area of the Americas was supposed to be, that we tried so hard to do more than a decade ago, and those negotiations unfortunately failed. So I think there's a role for the United States to deepen its partnership in the Americas and try to rebuild the things that, the values and the objectives that we were fighting for just a decade ago.
Jeff, if I could just add to that briefly, and thanks, Chris. I think that there are examples. We've got these 4 countries in the Pacific Alliance, but one example that to me is just the most amazing, when we were immersed within last year in this debate, which frankly dragged on for more than half a decade, and that was whether or not we would proceed with this U.S.-Colombia free trade agreement. And I will tell you that one of the arguments that I made consistently also is that there is no country in modern world history that in a 5-year period of time has gone through a more positive transformation than Colombia. I mean, would you agree with that assessment? Is there any place that in a 5-year period of time in modern history that went from the kind of repression that existed, and I mean, it was clearly, I mean, Medellin was the murder capital of the world, and now it's virtually a garden spot, thanks to Sergio Fajardo and the leadership that he showed as mayor there. I mean, my point is that these four nations that have been part of this alliance, I think are coming together. The real point is it's a way to, if not compete with, it's really to complement what's taking place in Asia. And so I completely agree with you, Jeff, and it gets to the point that Mike and I were both making, is anytime you can break down these barriers and expand and include countries, that's why I say NAFTA EU as opposed to US EU. And similarly, I would love to see the United States join with Peru and Colombia and Mexico and Chile as part of the Pacific Alliance.
Yeah. No, I think that's an objective that we should be engaging more in Latin America. And the U.S. initiatives in the region, trade initiatives, had taken a back seat, in part because we had basically dragged our feet on implementing the free trade agreement with Colombia. That was a big drawback for us. I don't think it's going to be possible for those countries to join the TPP immediately. But as Mike Moore said, we need to get them engaged. They should be
Which countries? Because
the
I mean,
Pacific Alliance.
Well, three of the four already are. I'm saying that Colombia.
Well, actually, we should look at the Pacific Alliance, not just of those four countries, but there are many countries that are observers that are in the process of joining.
Right.
Costa Rica.
Costa Rica,
Panama,
and
exactly.
a number of other observers from outside of the region. I think it's important to look at what the Pacific Alliance is likely to be in just a few short years, which could be a very large integrated area in the western half of South America and Central America, and see how that bigger region can be included, because we don't want to exclude the countries that are in the process of joining the Pacific Alliance. We want it to be a living agreement that can continue to move forward in these evolving arrangements in the Pacific.
I want to ask Dan about Brazil in a second, but first, give me a sense of what happens to NAFTA in all of this. I mean, that's clearly sort of, in some ways, it's both the keystone, but it's also sort of a little bit, it's wobbly in its own right. What do you do to tie in NAFTA?
To tie in NAFTA with the Pacific Alliance or TPP?
TPP.
Well, essentially, we've done it. With the inclusion of Canada and Mexico into the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks at the end of last year, we have gotten out of a box we were in. The NAFTA, when it was negotiated in the early 90s, was the state of the art. But the world economy has changed dramatically since then. And so a lot of things that Carla Hills did in putting together this great trade agreement really is a bit out of date. And needed upgrading. But given the politics in Washington, it was very difficult to renegotiate the NAFTA. In fact, the politics in Canada and Mexico as well. So joining the TPP is a way of upgrading NAFTA without having to renegotiate it. But I also would subscribe to what David said. We should be working more closely together to integrate our trade policies. And I know Carla Hills is a big supporter of what you recommended.
She taught me this.
That the North American economy should be negotiating with Europe as well. Right. But first of all, we're together in the TPP, and that'll provide the means of deepening our integration.
And it's a really interesting point that Jeff makes about the fact that we are way behind from where we were 2 decades ago when the NAFTA was negotiated. I argue that government and trade policy is almost always behind the marketplace and innovation and creativity. I mean, we look at Gordon Moore's law, I mean, the same thing happens. And so the idea of believing that government and negotiators are going to be able to keep up with that, it's a constant ongoing struggle. And I think, frankly, in these negotiations on any of the, the multilateral agreements, plurilateral agreements, a global agreement, there should be a specific effort focused on thinking about what's coming next, beyond where we are now. I mean, there should be a group thinking like, okay, well, we're dealing with this structure that exists today, but there are going to be technological changes that are going to take place in the coming years that will make what is being discussed in the Trans-Pacific Partnership look as old as the NAFTA does, and it'll probably happen more rapidly than the 2 decades it's taken place to get from NAFTA to today.
Yeah. Let's bring in Brazil, because that's clearly the 800-pound gorilla in South America right now, the darling of the investor community. What's Brazil doing while all these other more, let's say, liberally oriented countries
Sure.
are embarking on that
Well,
policy?
first of all, whatever the travails of jet lag, it's more than outweighed by the benefits of being out of the 120-degree heat in Delhi. So thank you for the chance to be in temperate Los Angeles for this. The Pacific Alliance is in some ways a reaction to the intransigence of Brazil when it comes to real, serious regional integration. Brazil famously thwarted the free trade area of the Americas, which was kind of, for a decade, really the focus of U.S. policy in the hemisphere. And it was these 4 countries that said, fine, we will go around Brazil and we'll take advantage of our position on the Pacific coast to do something much more pragmatic and that moves beyond the kind of ideological hang-ups that they saw on the Brazilian side. Brazil, on the other hand, has been much more focused on building its global presence, even as it's been quite reticent to integrate in its own region, and that's where IBSA comes in. Now, I'm sure most of you in this room know very well what the BRICS are, which was, for a long time just a catchy slogan that a Goldman Sachs
What are the
economist
BRICS,
had
Dan?
coined.
What are the BRICS? Tell me.
I'll explain to you later.
Okay.
And the BRICS became a formal grouping in 2009 and has since, every time the BRICS leaders meet, it tends to attract headlines in the United States at least. IBSA has been much more under the radar. So what is IBSA, which was the title that Chris gave my piece in this issue.
It was going to be
It's-
what the hell is IPSA, but I've edited myself.
Okay, well, thank you for that. It's a grouping that India, Brazil, and South Africa formed in 2003. And the story that President Lula of Brazil always told, and this may be apocryphal, but it's a colorful story, so we'll assume that it's good history. He was invited, along with his counterparts from South Africa and India, to be an observer at the G8 meeting in France in 2003. And you can imagine the conversation that happened among G8 foreign ministers and heads of state. They said, well, these are promising developing nations. Let's encourage them and let them kind of sit on the margins as we make the great decisions about how the world's going to work. And Lula, as you can imagine, didn't take that kindly to this scenario. And so as the G8 heads of state were making their big decisions at the high table, he was sitting on the sidelines with his counterparts from India and South Africa, and he said to them, what's the point of being invited just for dessert at the banquet of the powerful? I want to be there for the main course, I want to be there for dessert, and I want to be there for coffee. And a week later, they decided to form this new grouping, which was going to be above all about changing the shape of global governance. So there are kind of a few different tracks to IBSA. They have managed to meet every year, roughly every year, which is, for anyone who's worked in a policymaking position, that's actually a huge challenge to get your head of state to a far-off capital for one of these 2 or 3 day summits. They've managed to increase trade among the 3 countries tenfold in about a 10-year period. It's still quite low compared to, say, Indian-Chinese trade or Brazil-Chinese trade, but it's gone from a very, very paltry $4 billion to about $40 billion. They've worked on doing joint development projects in one another's regions. So when India or Brazil looks to increase their presence in sub-Saharan Africa, but haven't had the traditional relationships or infrastructure to do that, they can work with South Africa to do a development project in Burundi, or the Indians and South Africans can work with Brazil to do a development project in Haiti. But then most importantly, they've come together as this kind of common negotiating bloc with the goal of, first of all, getting themselves permanent seats on the Security Council, which is still taken as the kind of symbolic center of global governance and global power, but to really change the way that global decisions work. And there have been a number of attempts that have really, for people sitting in Washington, been a source of great frustration and outrage, because you look at each one of these societies and you say, these are democracies, they're diverse, they're multi-ethnic, they look something like us, and whereas we're a little bit skittish about the rise of China, and that raises certain fears about what an authoritarian China might mean for the future of the international system.
Mention also Syria, where they try to...
Right, and we can talk about one example of this. These are countries that look like us, and yet they're not really doing what we would like them to do. And there's this ongoing great frustration in Washington. There was a couple cases that were sources of particular outrage. One was Brazil's efforts with Iran to insert itself into the center of diplomacy over the Iranian nuclear program, which essentially put the U.S.-Brazil relationship on hold for a couple of years because we didn't like the efforts they were making. And you can argue about whether or not their approach was smarter than ours and whether those were good faith efforts. But fundamentally, there was a sense in Washington that, who are you to play with the big boys on this issue, what we're doing, what we're trying to do. And then more recently, in 2011, was the first time that India, Brazil, and South Africa were all sitting on the UN Security Council together. And so this was their first opportunity to really play in this most important sandbox of global decision-making when it came to security. And when Syria started deteriorating in 2011, the 3 of them said, we think we have a special role to play here. We're 3 democracies, but we're not the United States. We're not one of the traditional Western powers. We don't have the legacy of colonialism or imperialism. in the region that those powers have, and so we think we have a special role. And they sent a IBSA delegation to Syria. It met with Bashar al-Assad in August 2011, extracted what it thought were these promises of a reform process, and trumpeted this great advance in the ongoing crisis there. And that fell apart quite quickly. And that was very much a chastening experience for IBSA. But I think it is an example of what they will try to do in the future, and it's something that the U.S. has to reckon with.
Chris, would you mind if I actually quoted
Go
an
ahead.
article in America's Quarterly
It's
written by one of the authors about a subject that the other author, I think has
that's,
something to say about?
Please do.
Jeff wrote about Mercosur, and Mercosur itself was there was a great deal of promise with this trading bloc that was launched by Brazil, and it included Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile was an associate member, and all of these great things. And Jeff, in his piece, points to the fact that it was once promising, but it has become both political and protectionist. And I just wonder if you, Dan, have any thoughts about the impact that has on the India, Brazil, South Africa relationship, the direction that Brazil has led Mercosur.
Well, all three of these economies have a similarly political and protectionist approach to integration efforts in their own regions. And all three of them have in different ways really benefited from trade and from globalization and investment, but are very, very slow to open up further and have an essentially kind of autarkic approach to their own economies, which is a source of frustration to their neighbors and a source of frustration to American businesses that would like to trade and invest. But really, I think in their DNA, there's this essentially autarkic, this protectionist gene that is certainly still there.
Well, do you think we can break that? I mean, is
Well,
that, is
and
the
let me
rest
add
of the world
something
does?
too. The other issue is that before even going, Mercosur, if you look at, which is another article in here, by Leone Garcia, if you look at sort of the total number of combined GDPs of all the FTAs that Chile has and Peru has, and then look at the combined GDP of all the Mercosur free trade agreements, which are just the Mercosur countries and Israel, Palestine. Chile and Peru total about $50 trillion GDP. Mercosur is $600 billion. So, they clearly are being left in the dust by a series of free trade agreements. And what does that mean in terms of their free trade position? Either one.
Well, first thing you have to realize is that when countries pursue free trade agreements, it's for both strategic and commercial reasons. And certainly the United States did that. NAFTA was an important example. China, when it negotiated with the Southeast Asian countries, it was primarily for political reasons, to add a political overlay on their commercial. Mercosur started as a means of trying to integrate the region. But the differences between Brazil and Argentina became so stark, and Argentine protectionism in manufacturing was unbending, that you saw a big change. And during Lula's years, there was really a refocusing of using Mercosur for political purposes. And they have lost sight and lost the advantage of their using integration to promote their economic development and competitiveness. And the countries have become less and less competitive internationally.
What does that mean now with the accession of Venezuela and Bolivia to Mercosur? It's going to do well by for the Brazilian companies that are and exporting to Venezuela, clearly.
No, not clearly.
Well, in the short term, agriculture, they get the toilet paper, they sell a lot of toilet paper to Venezuela.
Well, yeah, but that won't make Brazil rich. I think what it has meant, and this I'll quote a Brazilian economist, is that Mercosur has become dysfunctional. It is no longer an economic integration organization.
Yeah.
Dan mentioned that it's in the DNA of India, Brazil, and South Africa to be protectionist. Now, that was in the DNA of many of the countries that today are passionate global free traders. And I wonder if you see any kind of prospect of altering that course.
Well, India is a fascinating example because India's economic opening in the last 20 years has been just as much as the rise of China, one of the kind of great success stories of globalization and the great success stories of market economics in the last several decades. And you had, for many of those
But it's still a
years,
closed
10%
economy,
growth.
by and large, a closed
It's still
economy.
by and large, but compared to what it was
Right.
in the
Right.
80s, it is
Yep.
kind of
Open,
flourishing,
yeah.
open place. And every Indian political party has had a role in bringing that success. Every single one of them wants to run away from it as quickly as possible. No one will claim that success. And the political shift hasn't happened, but there's been a real slowdown in all three of these economies now, certainly in India. And there's a sense of panic you feel in India now about whether the model is still working. And so you might need a little bit of this panic before that political economy starts to change.
I actually introduced legislation calling for negotiations on a U.S.-India free trade agreement.
It's
How'd that go?
profoundly
Yeah,
optimistic.
how'd that go?
That's
Yeah.
exactly right, yeah.
But when you did, there was more of a consensus in Indian politics and an opening, a small, narrow window to move forward.
The trade minister opposed me, by the way. The trade minister supported me. The foreign minister opposed me.
Yeah. And the trade minister in India understood that the key to improving productivity in the Indian economy was doing more on services, like Mike Moore said earlier, because that would boost the productivity of the agricultural sector, the manufacturing. But now the political consensus has evaporated, much like in Washington, and so it's very hard to do anything on the Indian front. The Brazilians are still surviving on high commodity prices, though their growth rate has plummeted because they have now an overvalued currency, and their manufacturing sector is being hurt very badly. So Brazil is now in a lot more trouble than they were before.
Yeah, and I think there's a sense of panic even growing there that you mentioned. Let's actually open it up for questions here, because I've had a couple very provocative presentations and now a discussion. I want to hear your
Can
thoughts.
I interrupt for just a moment? Wallace Annenberg is in the
Oh,
Annenberg
yes.
Space for Photography. I just spotted her over here.
Yes.
So, Wallace, thank you very much
Thank
for being
you.
here. And Wallace, you should know that before everyone came, I talked about this before you got here, this amazing exhibit. And here we are the day after Memorial Day, obviously, to remember the war dead. And our goal here, with all this stuff that we're talking about, is to ensure that we never, ever again have to go through what is pictured on the walls here at the Annenberg Space for Photography. So thank you very much again, Wallace, for everything that you do.
Are the ladies and gentlemen going to see the digital presentation?
I'm not sure if that, I think that may, I'm sure we could put that up.
Yeah, we can tee it
because
up.
we're
We
going to
have
be
a
here
break.
throughout the day, during the break. It is.
Special.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, we'll have time in between the lunch,
Yep.
so we'll see if we can tee it up.
Thanks, Wallace. Thanks.
Questions? Don't be shy. Put your hand up. Right here. I don't think do we have a microphone, or I think it's a small room. We can just, here comes a microphone. Hold on. It's being carried at you like an Olympic torch.
Yeah, how would each
Oh,
of
the microphone's right behind. And identify yourself, too,
you...
please.
Okay. Oh, thank you. My name is Dennis Torres. How would each of you individually, or if only one or two or three of you want to speak to the issue, overcome the personal self-interest of those in a position to influence government in helping the people of these various countries in the free trade?
That's the biggest challenge that I've been working on trade and economic integration for 40 years. That is the biggest challenge. And I think from my institute, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, what we have been trying to do, and what's so important that David and the Annenberg-Dreier Commission are embarked on doing, is providing for a more informed public debate, so that there is a better understanding of the opportunities that can be created by increasing global engagement. It's more difficult to make that case when you have a great deal of uncertainty in the marketplace. And then everyone becomes understandably more conservative. They are concerned about their jobs, and so they don't want to do anything that increases risk. But I think with a more informed discussion of these issues, as we're having here, as particularly on the new issues that David and his colleagues are going to be studying and speaking about, I think that's about the only way you can do it, because you will have people who have vested interests, who will lose a bit if there's more competition in the marketplace, but there are many more people who don't have a big voice who will gain if there is more opportunity, more growth in the economy, and that's what we have to strive for.
I can just add one thing, too. I think what makes TPP a little bit different, too, is the size and scope of it. The strategy of picking off single free trade agreements with countries, bilateral agreements, whether it's Chile, Colombia, Panama, Peru, has sort of run its course. I think there's a certain amount of free trade fatigue that became more, you were there, you know, it's difficult, whereas now we're talking about something huge that really makes a difference in terms of the market opening. It makes it a lot easier to sort of do this in one giant gulp.
And we call this the largest agreement, and by virtue of that, it means it's the closest thing you could get to a global WTO-type agreement.
In some ways, it goes beyond that, because in the WTO, you're seeking freer trade in
Right.
incremental steps.
Right.
But TPP will be seeking a much deeper level of liberalization and deregulation.
Right.
Let me just also say just a few numbers here, just to give you an idea. In 1995, the United States was the #1 source of imports for Argentina. By 2011, that sunk to the 3rd source of imports from Argentina. And then you can go down the line, where either in relative terms or in absolute terms, the U.S. position as a trade partner in the hemisphere has declined. And what this opportunity it means is sort of increasing U.S. exports, and that does mean, yes, competition, but it does mean actually increased U.S. jobs.
One other figure that I actually thought of that is really instructive as you look at the Pacific Alliance coming together and possibly broadening that, and as you say, Jeff, it'd be great if the United States were part of it. The International Monetary Fund has looked at the size of the middle class in Asia. Today, there are 500 million people throughout Asia who are considered to be, by the IMF definition, in the middle class. Within 7 years from now, by 2020, the IMF projection is that the number in the middle class in Asia will go to at least, many people think it'll be beyond that, 1.7 billion people. So that is just an incredible market that is developing as we see the Pacific Alliance and other blocs come together to, in a 7-year period of time, go from 500 million people to 1.7 billion at least, is going to be really daunting and create, I think, a tremendous global opportunity.
Yeah. More questions?
Hi, my name is Scott Hines. I'm a city councilman in Rancho Mirage, former mayor of where Sunnylands is located.
Scott, nice to see you again.
You as well. My question is around education, and it's a great segue with what you just said of the increasing middle class. And I just got back from Shanghai, so I'm feeling the jet lag as well. You know, one of the millennial goals of the UN and UNESCO in particular is universal access to education. And yet we know in many of the Latin American countries and Asia as well, education is woefully inadequate. It's lacking in both secondary and certainly higher education. What are you seeing trend-wise with regards to increasing access and quality of education to keep the momentum of the TPP moving forward?
Do you want to start, Jeff?
Well, I guess one of the areas where the TPP can make some progress in that is enhancing cross-border flow of education services. China made great breakthroughs in that area when it negotiated its free trade agreement with New Zealand. And there's a substantial increase in flows of students from China to New Zealand. If you go anywhere in the United States, you'll see many, many Chinese students learning here. And that's really important, not only for providing an educated class for foreign countries, but also a better understanding of the United States. And indeed, when I met with Chinese officials over last month when I was in China, those that had been educated in the United States seemed to get it. They understood where the United States was coming from, and there wasn't the tension or the friction that you would normally have because of negotiators or officials not understanding the objectives of the other. Mm-hmm. So I think the work on services in the TPP, particularly promoting increased flow of educational services can be a big long-term gain for the region.
So the agreements themselves can actually play a role in enhancing the level of education.
Opening opportunities to access.
They're also in the Pacific Alliance. There are provisions for educational exchanges among all 4 countries, which will be very important in terms of, and the United States is trying to take advantage of this as well with its 100,000 strong program, is sending U.S. citizens to U.S. students to Latin America to learn, to become bilingual, to learn sort of the economic dynamics to better train them. And of course, in Brazil, President Obama announced with Dilma Rousseff, the president of Brazil, the Science Without Borders program, or that the U.S. was going. And now there are literally 100,000 students who are coming, tens of thousands of students now from Brazil that are coming to study primarily science, technology, engineering, and math, STEM, at U.S. universities throughout the country, not just the MITs and the Harvards and Stanfords of the world, but throughout the United States. And that's very powerful because it creates that bond. Yeah, you were part of it.
Just that one of the most important things that these transnational networks, whether it's IPSA or the Pacific Alliance, can do is share best practices among these countries, many of which have really pioneered new advances in education policy and social policy. So to take an IPSA example, Brazil has had a very successful program called Bolsa Familia, which is conditional cash transfers, meaning, as a parent, as long as you're sending your kid to school, as long as you're sending them to the doctor, you get a direct payment from the government. And so it's a way of both increasing incomes for those in poverty and encouraging certain kinds of behavior related to education. And I was really thrilled to talk to a delegation from India that had gone to Brazil to study their experience with conditional cash transfers to support education under the auspices of IPSA. And that kind of sharing of best practices can really, really change the way education policy is formed in many of these countries and in the U.S.
Yeah, and I will say this, we have a World Bank study and a study we do, the next issue is going to be dedicated in part to social inclusion. When you look at sort of the single indicator, variable that most affects people's social mobility, it's education, access to education, and it's staying in school. So it's a huge, hugely important issue that obviously there's a lot of need for learning, whether it's conditional cash transfers or the like. We had a question here that before, let's, if you,
yes.
No. Actually, why don't you stand up and yell? You don't need to take the microphone away from them. Just yell. You can speak.
Well,
loudly.
we want her on camera, though.
Yes, we want to.
Oh,
yes.
she's.
We
That's
want everyone
right.
to hear
We
this,
are.
Beth.
This is being webcast.
This is Beth Lowe. Everyone wants to hear from Beth.
Well, good morning. I am Beth Lowe, and David, you mentioned in your opening remarks that 40% of the trade between Asia and U.S. came through our ports. How does that compare with the other port cities in the Americas on the West Coast?
Well, it's
and is there a competition with Mexico?
yeah. Well, I mean, it's a great question because one of the challenges that we have, because of so much regulation and, frankly, because of union contracts and other things, it plays a role in increasing costs. And so we've seen a dramatic expansion in ports south of our border. And there are things that are going and coming through those routes as well. So right now it is at that number of 40%. And I'm not on any of the boards that deal specifically with the ports, but I do know that as we see more and more of this goods movement taking place, as we see, I mean, this morning's report on real estate prices and the surge in the market that's taken place this morning is an indication that we are obviously going to be seeing greater growth, and I suspect that that'll be more trade. So it means that there'll be even more that'll be going in both directions through those ports. But I personally think that I think it's great that we're seeing, the proverbial rising tide lifts all boats. I mean, speaking of ports, I guess. And I think that in light of that, I think that we can all benefit. The Americas can benefit from the utilization of ports, and the United States can as well.
We've got the Panama Canal extension, too.
Yeah, right.
So
There's
the
a
need for
yep,
deep
yep,
water
so-
ports as well.
Right.
Let's go back to the man who was cut off. Sorry about that.
Thank you, no problem at all. Carlos Valderrama, good morning, everyone. I was a little bit late, so I don't know if this subject matter was covered, but here in the Americas, we have an unbroken chain of free trade agreements, except Ecuador. We have a lot of elements in which our small and medium-sized companies can do more business in Latin America. But I guess my question is, what do we need to do to convince the small and medium-sized companies that international trade is really a must, so to speak, in terms of the development of the businesses? Because clearly, these folks are not really going overseas.
I think it's a great question. It's one that you know, I've regularly dealt with. Frankly, I mean, contrary to what you say, there are tremendous numbers of both small and medium-sized businesses that are, in fact, getting involved internationally in trade, exporting, importing. And what we were talking about earlier, the whole supply chain has a lot of small businesses involved in that process. But there needs to be an ongoing effort. I mean, I've argued that the notion of, you know, again, like cross-border data flows, you say free trade, well, that makes one's eyes glaze over, and that's why I point to the fact that this ends up creating jobs, improving the standard of living and quality of life for those who are struggling at the lowest end of the economic spectrum. And we need to do everything that we can to enhance that. And I think that we need to regularly, this gets back to the question raised about education, we need to regularly educate about the fact that there are markets that don't exist. I'll tell you an incredible thing for me, and this sort of goes beyond, it just has to do with the education of this. I was in Central America several months ago, and I met with the presidents of both El Salvador and Guatemala. And President Funes and Reyes barely even understood what the Central American Free Trade Agreement was about, the presidents of the country. Because it was something done by their predecessors, and it's something that needs to be kept on the forefront. And so I think it gets to the issue of education. I think that you know, organizations like the National Federation of Independent Business, these other groups that are out there, the chambers of commerce, need to talk about the opportunities that exist for small and medium-sized businesses in both new markets and with the prospect of the import of raw materials.
But there are two other things, and this issue is part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. Mm-hmm. There's a chapter on how to promote the integration of small and medium-sized enterprises in Asia-Pacific trade. There's going to be mostly efforts to improve transparency, the access of information online, so that there are things that are published in English as well as in the national language available to any company. That alone has been a big hurdle for companies, small companies, engaging in international trade. And the U.S. embassies are trying to do more to actually be an advance guard or scout for new opportunities, and then send the information back home so that they're...
and we have the Export Council. There are lots of organizations around that do expend time, and government and non-governmental organizations that spend time and energy and effort on this whole notion of increasing that flow in education.
Right. But the bottom line, last point, the bottom line on this is that it is, just because of scale, difficult for small and medium-sized enterprises to engage in a big way. But many of them do engage as part of this supply chain. Mm-hmm. And so as supplying other U.S. firms or other foreign firms that are engaged in trade, they are dependent on that trade and becoming increasingly active.
Question right here. Microphone is on the way.
Good morning. Thank you all very much. This has been a very informative dialogue and conversation. My name is Conchita Sarnoff. I have a foundation, the Alliance to Rehabilitate Trafficked Children in Washington, D.C. And one of the issues, having been investigating since 2006, many of the nations that form part of the TPP have substantial numbers of trafficked children. Mm-hmm. And there are, according to the latest polls, over 20 million children being trafficked globally. My question to you, to any of you, is, are you doing anything about this issue, given the sectors such as education and poverty?
Wow.
Thank you.
I wish I was doing more, but I'm inspired by what Dan said, that the way to keep children in school is to encourage their parents, or give their parents an incentive to keep children in school. And so the program in Brazil has been successful, but it means a commitment of funds. And perhaps there's ways of a broader community of nations supporting these types of programs, so it doesn't all have to be dependent on the vagaries of deficit finance in a poor country. That would be how an economist would first look at it, but there are many, many more things that need to be done besides
I mean, I would add to that I think that it's very important as we look at this whole goal of global trade is to enhance the standard of living and the quality of life for people. And as that happens, it seems to me that there is potentially, I mean, no guarantee, a diminution of that, flow and trafficking. Because, I mean, it happens, it isn't happening primarily in developing nations. I mean, that's where you see this primarily. So as these nations see their improvement, I mean, I would like to think, and maybe this is kind of amorphous and just out there, that what we're trying to do here will, along with dealing with global poverty, along with, I'm sure that poverty plays a big role in expanding that. So global GDP growth is probably the most important thing on human rights, dealing with this trafficking of children and these other factors, and then programs, like Jeff mentions, of, education and all.
If I can just say, Conchita, that's a great issue, and I think, not to sound too much of a Pollyanna, but trade agreements do provide an opportunity for governments to serve as a clearinghouse, to share information, to sort of tighten procedures and regulations for everything on trade, and to make it much more transparent. And I would hope, again, another benefit of globalization isn't just trade,
right,
but it's about non-governmental organizations being able to raise awareness, push governments for transparency, and it raises these issues directly with heads of state when they sit down at the table. And on that point, the next issue of America's Quarterly, the 2 issues from now, the next one is going to be on energy, is going to be on the evolution of philanthropy. I toss that out as a possible idea for an article. Why not talk about sort of how free trade can be a hindrance or a help to issues of human trafficking and other sorts of issues.
Which is it? Answer? Will you answer it, Chris?
I personally think it provides a forum, and we've seen this actually in cases of labor disputes in say, CAFTA countries. We've seen this in other, you have available, whether it's through the OAS Inter-American Human Rights System or others, the ability and the mechanisms funded through, in the case of CAFTA DR, that allowed for strengthening of, in this case, labor courts and provisions to be able to better protect labor that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And to get to those standards, it required a whole series of negotiation and funding, and now you've elevated at an international level that it would not have happened had those free trade agreements not occurred.
Good answer.
But
thank you.
I have something for you. As a member of the editorial board, let me give you some advice.
Please do.
Why don't you ask Conchita to write about this problem in that issue?
And you just did. It came from the editorial board, so there we go. Any other potential authors? We have a hand right behind Gustavo. Okay, that'll be the last question. So, but we're waiting for a microphone, though, because we were going to have that one be the last, but we'll have.
Or maybe we can take 2 together and we can answer quickly.
Yeah, why don't we just take 2? Sorry about this, Jeff. We'll take 2 together, because then you'll get. So, go ahead, ask your question.
Hi, my name is Francisco Correa. I wanted to ask, I work for the Trade Commission of Chile. I wanted to ask, all these free trade agreements, they imply, we've been talking a lot about trade, trade of goods, basically. That's what we do, but there's more than that in the free trade agreements. Services, you mentioned at the beginning, intellectual property, knowledge, capital, human capital, etc. So I want to ask your vision of the challenges of trading besides just goods, all the other stuff, and how do you see the strategic vision of Latin America being part of that?
Good. Let's pass the microphone up here and quickly take this question. Pass the microphone up
Right
here.
here, right up here.
Take this question.
Good morning. I'm Bert Wang from China's Guangming Daily, Washington Bureau. I have a question for David. First of all, congratulations for Sunnyland.
Thank you.
Yeah, because
very
in
much.
China we, I think 1.3 billion Chinese people now, eyes catching on the Sunnylands. Yeah, I wonder what really made Sunnyland, President Obama choose Sunnyland to be the venue for the summit. I mean, what's the unique from Sunnyland? And in order to prepare for this summit, what Sunnyland will do or already done for the summit. And what's the implication by this summit to Latin American countries? Thank you. I have also a question for Jeff. Nice to see you here again, Jeff. Yeah. Before, in my interview with you at the office, you said it will take a long time for China to join the TPP. But I wonder, do you have if your views will change after your trip to China? What Chinese officials look at the TPP?
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Goods and services and trade, Sunnylands and China TPP.
Yeah. Let me just say that on the services issue, I think that, I equate all of them. I say that the free flow of goods, services, capital, information, ideas, and people. I put all of this together, and so I believe that you shouldn't just focus one, at the expense of another. So I see it all as really pretty much a monolithic block, in that we want to encourage all of those things. That's my personal view, and that's really the goal that we have with our commission. Let me thank you for that. As far as Sunnylands is concerned, it's very exciting. This will be, and Wallace, you should know, if you think about all the things that your father and Lee did there, the idea of having the President of the United States and the President of the People's Republic of China hold a summit, this will be the first time ever that the leaders of China and the United States have actually had a retreat together. There have been meetings going back, beginning with Richard Nixon's Shanghai Communique in the 1970s, that obviously created this opening. But never before has there been a retreat. And so to have it take place on June 7th and 8th at Sunnylands is, I think, great. They are going to love it. I always like to say of Sunnylands that the best one can describe Sunnylands is in black and white, but you experience it in Technicolor Panavision, because it's just such an overwhelming spot. And I know that President Xi Jinping, as well as President Obama, will be very impressed, and I encouraged President Obama at the end of last year to make sure that he came to Sunnylands. As far as the agenda, that's being developed. We know the traditional issues that are there. We hope very much that we're able to see a breakthrough in a number of areas. The news that has just come out today. We know about the entire cybersecurity threat issue. That clearly is going to be a topic of discussion. North Korea is going to be a topic of discussion. Human rights will continue to be a topic of discussion. And of course, this issue of trade. A few weeks ago, I wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal in which I actually advocated China's entry into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what I said is that it needed to comply with the guidelines set forth. Now, I've said there are two criteria all along for entry into TPP, and those were actually implemented, adhered to by Mexico, Canada when they joined, and Japan will next month, or in July probably, be joining. And it is that nothing be done to hold up the process of negotiating, and everything is on the table. Now, frankly, China could not comply with those constraints today, but aspirationally, I happen to personally believe that since, as Mike mentioned, in 2000, we brought through permanent normal trade relations China into the World Trade Organization, I believe that rather than seeing the Trans-Pacific Partnership as a poke in the eye, that similarly China should see this as an opportunity for them as well. And I hope that's discussed with the two presidents.
Yeah.
Comment briefly on goods and services?
Well, trade agreements aren't magic bullets to create prosperity. They create opportunities. And so governments do best in using trade agreements when they use them to supplement their own domestic economic reform. And that's what we've seen in Chile and Colombia and Peru, in Mexico. And it's been very successful because the commitment to the domestic economic reform brings in more investment, both from domestic sources and from foreign sources. And so that, I think, is the value of the trade agreement. It's both creates new opportunities, but it also creates more policy predictability. That governments will not suddenly reverse back into protectionism and render a lot of opportunities cold. So that's a key point. On the point of China, I was very impressed in my discussions this past week compared to last month that there seems to be a growing understanding that the TPP is not meant as a threat against China, but it should be seen as an opportunity to to work together more closely with China over the coming years.
That's the goal.
And I think my impression has been that all of the rhetoric about the United States trying to contain China through a trade agreement has now been pushed aside.
That was the reception of the pivot, you know, that
Yeah.
was the pivot would let them do that.
And that's really unrealistic. And but there is still a concern in China that they're not part of the process.
Right.
Now, how do you square that circle? And it could be that the way to do it, and which will require some discussions with other TPP members, is to change the longstanding policy of TPP members that there not be observer countries. Because you bring a country into the room, allow them to observe the process, they begin to be more informed on what the requirements are, but they also are less concerned about threats that the process may be used against them. And that would be a great achievement if you could bring China in, but why stop with China? Why not do it right away with Colombia and Costa Rica and Panama as we're trying to...
I think those could get in before China, frankly.
Oh, it's easier for those countries to qualify much more quickly.
Right.
But if you're not ready to expand the membership on day one, at least bring them all together at the table so that they can be knowledgeable partners and ready to move quickly when the opportunity is created.
Okay, with that, we're going to break for 15 minutes, reconvene. We've got a great panel on U.S. policy and scholarship, and then we've got the president of Peru, so please stick around. Thanks.
Great. Okay, nice job.
Bruce, good job.
Fellas?
Yes, please.
Jeff?